I still remember the scent of sandalwood that clung to my father's old jacket, a smell that always brought comfort to me as a child. Every Saturday afternoon, we would walk to the city park, our favorite place. My father loved taking me fishing. At the small pond there, though more often than not, we returned home empty-handed. But that never mattered. What mattered were the stories he shared, about life, about dreams we must fight for, and about how to love our family with all our hearts. My father was my protector, my best friend, and my first teacher. He always listened without judgment, giving me space to grow without feeling pressured. In his eyes, I saw a hopeful future. But it all crumbled in an instant on a gray night. A heart attack took him away suddenly, leaving me and my mother in piercing silence. I was 8 years old then, too young to understand that his departure marked the beginning of a profound change in my life. After my father passed away, the house that was once filled with laughter became silent. The sound of his heavy footsteps no longer echoed in the hallway, and his favorite chair in the living room remained empty, collecting dust. Mother rarely smiled anymore. Her eyes looked perpetually tired, as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. We both grieved, but in different ways. I tried to hold on to the beautiful memories I had with my father, while my mother, I didn't know what she felt. She distanced herself, barely speaking to me unless it was about daily necessities. Our lives changed drastically. My mother had to work twice as hard to cover household expenses. I learned to be independent from a young age, taking care of myself, and even helping clean the house. But despite my efforts to be a good child, I felt something was missing. The overflowing love I once received from my father. My mother was no longer the warm person she used to be. A chasm grew wider between us, and I didn't know how to bridge it. 4 years later, when I was 12, my mother brought a new man into our lives, Daniel. At first, I was skeptical. How could anyone possibly fill the void left by my father? But Daniel was different from what I had imagined. He didn't try to replace my father's position. Instead, he approached me with humility and understanding. He often asked if I was okay, listened to my stories without judgment, and slowly began building a relationship with me. However, that happiness didn't last long. 2 years after their marriage, my mother gave birth to a baby boy, Kevin. His arrival was met with joy by everyone, especially my mother. For the first time in years, I saw a genuine smile on her face. But behind that happiness, an uneasy feeling lingered in my heart. I couldn't quite pinpoint what I was feeling at the time, but I began to sense that everything was about to change again. The change happened gradually, like drops of water that eventually erode stone. At first, it was small things. For instance, my mother started buying more toys for Kevin than paying attention to my needs. Then, she began talking about Kevin more often at the dinner table, sharing how cute and smart he was. When I tried to talk about my day at school, her responses were often flat, as if her mind was elsewhere. As Kevin grew older, the difference in treatment became more apparent. My mother would wake up in the middle of the night if Kevin cried, but when I fell sick, she would only hand me medicine without much conversation. Daniel tried several times to balance the situation, ensuring I also received attention. However, I could see how difficult Daniel's position was between my mother and me. He tried to mediate, but it was clear that my mother was increasingly focused on Kevin. There was one moment that left a deep impression on me. On my 14th birthday, I hoped my mother would bake a cake like my father used to do. But the day passed without any greetings or celebration. When I came home from school, I found my mother happily playing with Kevin in the living room, laughing cheerfully. My heart felt empty then, as if I no longer had a place in this house. Kevin's presence brought joy to my mother, but for me, he became a symbol of the love I had lost. and though I tried to understand, that feeling never truly went away. I just learned to hide it because no one seemed willing to listen to me anymore. As I grew older, the difference in how my mother treated me compared to Kevin became increasingly clear. A silent line that separated us under the same roof. I often felt like a shadow, present but unseen. When I returned home late at night, after school practice or exams, my mother rarely asked how my day went. On the other hand, when Kevin, who was only 6 years old, coughed slightly, she immediately panicked and rushed him to the doctor. One night, I was studying for my final semester exams. Kevin started crying because his toy broke. My mother immediately left the kitchen, where I was sitting with textbooks scattered on the table, and hurried to Kevin's room. Half an hour later, I heard their laughter through the door. I lowered my head, trying to focus on my studies, but tears began to flow silently. It wasn't jealousy toward Kevin. It was the realization that the love my mother once gave me had vanished, replaced by her obsession with her younger son. Sometimes I tried to talk to my mother about how I felt. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" I asked one afternoon as she sat watching TV while holding Kevin. She just smiled faintly and said, "You're grown up now. You can take care of yourself." That answer made my chest tighten. Yes, I was grown up. But did that mean I no longer needed affection? Daniel was the only one who still tried to pay attention to me. Though he wasn't my biological father, he always supported me in his own way. Every Saturday morning, he would take me jogging in the park near our house. There, he would listen to my stories without interrupting, offering advice without being overbearing. "You're amazing, kid," he said one day. "Never doubt yourself, even if the world sometimes seems cold." However, his efforts to balance attention between me and Kevin often clashed with my mother's attitude. One night, Daniel tried to discuss the need for equal time and energy within the family. "Dear, we have to make sure Anissa feels loved too," he said softly. My mother shot him a sharp look. "Anissa is old enough. She can understand," she replied coldly. Daniel just sighed and didn't continue the conversation. Still, Daniel remained my quiet protector. He often slipped small notes of encouragement onto my desk. "Keep fighting, you can do it." Sometimes he brought me my favorite food when I stayed up late studying. He never spoke much, but his actions always reminded me that I hadn't been completely forgotten. The relationship between Daniel and my mother grew tense as Kevin became increasingly spoiled. My mother always pampered him, even for trivial things. If Kevin wanted a new toy, she would buy it without hesitation. If Kevin refused to eat, she would force Daniel to take him to an expensive restaurant. One day, when Kevin was 8 years old, he refused to do his homework. "I'm tired, Mom," he whined. My mother immediately nodded and said, "Rest first, dear. Mom will help you later." Daniel, who happened to overhear, immediately objected. "Don't spoil him too much. This is important for his development," he said firmly. My mother flared up. "He's still a child, Daniel. You don't understand," she snapped. Their argument lasted several minutes, and I could only sit in the corner of the living room, watching everything with mixed feelings. On one hand, I agreed with Daniel that Kevin needed to learn responsibility. But, on the other hand, I felt relieved because all their attention was focused on Kevin, allowing me to breathe freely for a moment from expectations and pressure. Despite the less-than-ideal family environment, I was determined not to let myself drown in anger or sadness. I poured all my energy into my studies. Daniel always supported me in this. He often read additional references from his book collection and helped me register for various academic competitions. When I was in high school, I managed to join the school's math Olympiad team. Daniel was so proud. "This is a great achievement. Kid," he said, patting my shoulder. "Your father would be so proud." Hearing those words warmed my heart, though memories of my father still felt painfully raw. However, my mother's support for my achievements was almost non-existent. When I came home with a gold medal from a regional competition, she simply commented, "Good for you." No hug, no congratulations. I tried not to care, but a part of my heart shattered bit by bit every time I realized my sacrifices were never appreciated by the person who should have been proudest of me. When it was time to choose a university, I immediately decided to study out of town, as far away from home as possible. For me, this was an opportunity to start anew, far from the tension and injustice I had endured for years. Daniel supported my decision. "You deserve freedom, kid," he said one night before I left. "Never hesitate to chase your dreams." My mother, on the other hand, seemed indifferent. "If you feel you need to go, then fine," she said flatly. No expression of longing or concern. I just nodded, trying to hold back tears in front of her. At the train station on the day of my departure, Daniel came to see me off. He handed me a small envelope. "This is for you," he said with a gentle smile. Inside was a note that read, "Never. Stop believing in yourself. Dad is proud of you." My tears finally spilled as the train began to move. For the first time in years, I felt that someone truly loved me unconditionally. After graduating, I started my first job at a small but promising company. Every day was a new challenge. Long meetings, pressing deadlines, and fierce competition with colleagues. However, none of that deterred me from pursuing success. I worked hard, staying late into the night, and always striving to give my best in every project I faced. Slowly but surely, my career began to flourish. Within 5 years, I was promoted to team manager, a position I never imagined I could achieve. A higher salary helped me build a more stable life. I rented a small apartment in the heart of the city, furnishing the living room with simple pieces I bought with my own savings. For the first time, I felt true freedom. Free from family pressures, free from expectations that once hurt my heart. Yet despite the outside world opening its doors to me, there remained an empty corner in my heart. Memories of my father and Daniel often surfaced on lonely nights when I sat by the window of my apartment, gazing at the twinkling city lights like artificial stars. I wondered if they would be proud of me now, but that curiosity never found an answer. While I grew more independent, Kevin's situation at home moved in the opposite direction. He became a lazy young man, rarely working and always depending on our mother. Instead of studying or finding a job, he preferred sleeping all day or playing online games. When Daniel was still alive, he tried several times to motivate Kevin to find a part-time job, but Mother always shielded him. "He's still young," she'd say. "Let him enjoy his youth." But Kevin's laziness wasn't just about responsibility. He also began asking Mother for money for trivial things, buying new gadgets, eating at expensive restaurants, or even lending money to his friends. Money that should have been used for household needs often disappeared to fulfill Kevin's demands. Daniel frequently complained about this, but Mother always turned a blind eye. To her, Kevin was the top priority, no matter the cost. That day began like any other. I was in the middle of an important meeting at the office when my phone buzzed. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, but the voice on the other end wasn't his. It was the voice of a doctor at the local hospital. "I'm sorry. We have to inform you that your father suffered a sudden heart attack. We did everything we could, but..." The world seemed to stop spinning. Daniel was gone. Just like my father before him. I immediately left the meeting without explanation, jumping into a taxi headed to the hospital. There, I found my mother sitting in the waiting room, her face pale and her eyes wet with tears. Kevin stood beside her, looking awkward and unsure of what to do. I couldn't say anything. I just stood there, staring at Daniel's lifeless body, lying on the hospital bed, cold and motionless. My heart shattered. Daniel had been the only person who consistently supported me, who made me feel loved, even when the world seemed indifferent. Now, he was gone, leaving me in the same emptiness I felt when I lost my father. After Daniel's death, the household situation deteriorated further. Financially, my mother struggled to cover daily expenses. Daniel's pension wasn't enough to handle their growing expenses due to Kevin's lifestyle. Emotionally, the atmosphere at home became increasingly tense. Mother grew more stressed, while Kevin continued to live in his own world, seemingly indifferent to what was happening around him. Whenever I called to check on them, Mother always responded with a tone of despair. "Kevin refuses to work. I don't know what to do anymore," she said, holding back sobs. I could only listen silently, though inside I wanted to scream, "Maybe it's time you stopped spoiling him." Still, a part of me felt guilty. Even though I had long decided to distance myself from them, I still felt a moral responsibility to help. No matter how imperfect my family was, they were still my blood. A few months after Daniel's passing, Mother finally reached out to me. Her voice sounded weak, almost desperate. "Anissa, I need your help," she said softly. I could hear the tremble in her voice, the fear she had kept hidden for so long. "For what, Mom?" I asked flatly, though my heart began to race. "Kevin, he needs tuition for a course, and the house bills are piling up." I fell silent. Part of me wanted to refuse, to say this was the consequence of all the poor choices they had made. But another part, the softer part, reminded me that they were my family. No matter how strained our relationship was, I couldn't leave them without hope. Finally, I took a deep breath and said, "All right, Mom, I'll help." But deep down, I knew this wasn't a permanent solution. It was just a temporary patch for a wound that was growing deeper. After several months of providing financial assistance, I finally decided to visit home after years of staying away. I came with the hope of helping to sort things out, though my heart was still filled with apprehension. However, what I saw as I stepped through the front door made my breath catch. The house looked like a ruin of past memories. The once clean walls were now stained and cracked. The furniture in the living room, once lovingly cared for by my father, was now dusty and broken. In the kitchen, dirty dishes piled up in the sink, unwashed for days. Even the front yard, where Father and I used to fish, was now overgrown with wild bushes. My heart felt heavy. This wasn't just a house in ruins. It was a reflection of their collapsed lives. My mother looked older than I remembered, her eyes weary and her body frail. Kevin, who should have been an adult by now, sat on the couch playing with his phone, completely indifferent to the chaos around him. I tried to smile, but it was hard to hold back the emotions suffocating the atmosphere in this house. During my visit, I also met Bella, Kevin's girlfriend. She was a young woman with a glamorous appearance that clearly didn't fit the sorry state of the house. From our brief conversation, I quickly realized that she was no different from Kevin, lazy, spoiled, and entirely dependent on my mother. "Bella wants to take a makeup course," Kevin said one afternoon, as if it were an urgent matter. "Mom said you could help pay for it, right?" I stared at him in disbelief. "A makeup course? For your girlfriend? Do either of you even have stable jobs?" Kevin just shrugged, as if my question didn't matter. "That's a problem for later. For now, just help us out." I pinched the bridge of my nose, trying to hold back my anger. How could they be so oblivious to responsibility? They lived like children who had never learned the meaning of hard work, while I had to sweat every day to build an independent life. Watching Bella lounging on the couch, snacking on food bought with my hard-earned money, made my blood boil. One night, when everyone was asleep, I decided to clean out the storage cabinet in the living room. I hoped to find important documents that might help improve the family's financial situation. But what I found instead made my heart race. Inside an old, dusty folder was a will signed by Daniel before his death. Its contents shocked me. Daniel had left all his assets to my mother, including property and savings. However, beneath it was a handwritten note by my mother herself, an official statement transferring the entire inheritance to Kevin. It felt like being struck by lightning. Not only had I been ignored as the eldest child, but my mother hadn't even considered dividing the inheritance fairly. All of Daniel's sacrifices for this family, all the effort he put into making me feel loved, it had all vanished because of my mother's selfishness. The next morning, I confronted my mother in the kitchen. Her face looked tired, but I didn't care. I placed the will on the table and stared at her sharply. Why, Mom? Why was the entire inheritance given to Kevin? Was I never part of this family? My mother was silent for a moment, then sighed deeply. Anissa, you're grown up now. You can take care of yourself. But Kevin, he needs more support. He's my child too. So I'm not your child? I asked, my voice trembling with anger and sadness. My mother lowered her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. I love you, sweetheart, but I've always felt closer to Kevin. He's weaker. He needs more protection. Her confession felt like a stab to the heart. All this time, I had worked so hard to earn a little of her attention, while she only saw me as a child who could be ignored because I was strong enough. My heart shattered hearing those words, but I knew this was the reality I had long avoided. After that confrontation, I decided to no longer be involved in their lives. I packed my belongings and left the house without saying much. Before leaving, I stood at the door and looked at my mother one last time. I'm sorry, Mom. I can't keep doing this anymore. I'm tired of trying to get love that was never given to me. In the car, I cried uncontrollably. It wasn't just about losing my family. It was about finally taking the step I had always feared, freeing myself from the emotional chains that had bound me for so long. I knew this was a difficult decision, but I also knew it was a step toward true freedom. As my car pulled away from the house, I felt the heavy burden on my shoulders begin to lift. For the first time in my life, I felt that I had finally chosen myself. And somehow I was sure Daniel would be proud of me. After leaving the house, I immediately took a major step that I had long avoided. I decided to stop all forms of financial assistance to my family. I knew this wasn't an easy decision, especially because guilt lingered in the back of my mind. The feeling that I might be abandoning them in their struggles. However, every time I reflected, I realized there would be no happy ending if I kept allowing myself to be taken advantage of without limits. Weeks after making that decision, I began to feel its consequences. My credit card bills were lighter. My savings started to grow, and I could finally breathe easier without the added monthly pressure. Yet, there was also an unavoidable sense of anxiety. What was happening to them? Was my mother still able to pay the house bills? What about Kevin? And Bella? These questions occasionally crossed my mind, but I reminded myself that they needed to learn to take responsibility for their own choices. I knew this was the price I had to pay for my freedom, and though it felt difficult, I knew it was the right step. Not long after I stopped providing assistance, my phone began ringing almost daily. On the other end, my mother's voice sounded desperate. "Anissa, please. We need money again," she pleaded. Sometimes, Kevin or even Bella would call, using increasingly absurd excuses. "We need to pay for a new course," Kevin said one day, "or we'll lose the house." But this time, I was no longer swayed. Every time they called, I responded with the same short sentence. "I'm sorry, I can't help." I didn't offer lengthy explanations or arguments. I knew they were just trying to manipulate my guilt, as they always had in the past. But this time, I wouldn't give in. The pressure came in waves. sometimes through text messages, phone calls, or even unannounced visits to my apartment. I always found ways to reject them, sometimes gently, sometimes firmly. I knew that every time I gave them an opening, they would keep taking more. So I decided not to give them any space at all. Ultimately, I realized this was the moment to make a final decision. I had to completely sever emotional ties with my family. This wasn't about hating them. It was about protecting myself from an endless cycle of neglect and exploitation. I knew they might never understand my reasons, but that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I was tired of being hurt. Began deleting their contact numbers from my phone one by one. When they tried to reach out, I immediately blocked their numbers. At first, my heart raced every time I did it, as if I were cutting bonds that had been formed over decades, but gradually, I felt relief, like I was shedding a heavy burden that had weighed on my shoulders for years. This decision wasn't the end of everything, but the beginning of a new chapter in my life. I knew my family might not be perfect, but I had the right to choose who deserved a place in my life, and unfortunately, they no longer belonged. Months after fully severing ties with my family, I began to feel something I had never experienced before: true freedom. For the first time in my life, I no longer felt bound by others' expectations. I no longer felt the need to prove myself to my mother, nor was I weighed down by responsibilities I had never asked for. My life began to feel lighter. I could wake up in the morning without the anxiety of unexpected demands from them. I could focus on my career and dreams without worrying that the fruits of my hard work would vanish into thin air. In fact, I started enjoying my free time, reading books, watching my favorite movies, or simply sitting on my apartment balcony savoring the evening breeze. One night, I sat in front of the mirror, staring at my own face. I smiled faintly, realizing that for the first time, I saw myself as someone worthy of love. Not just by others, but by myself. This journey wasn't easy, but I knew I had weathered the biggest storm of my life. On quiet nights, I often thought of Daniel. His warm face, his understanding smile, and his wise advice always lingered in my memory. I imagined what he would say if he were still here. Perhaps he would sit beside me, pat my shoulder, and say, "You're amazing, kid. You've finally found your strength." I believe Daniel would be proud of me. He always wanted me to be strong, independent, and brave enough to choose my own path. By making this decision, I felt like I was honoring his legacy, the legacy of love and hope he gave me when I was young. Though he never gave me his blood, he was truly a father to me. And now, I know I have carried forward the lessons he taught me. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe someday I'll meet my mother or Kevin again. But until that day comes, I will keep moving forward with my head held high. I have chosen myself, and that is my greatest victory.